if the classical approaches to organizational communication view an organization as a machine, then the human approaches to organizational communication would view an organization as a family. Um, what this means is that we have this movement, this response really to this machine metaphor. In the mid to late 1920s to the early 1960s, there's this movement that says revolutionary idea 2.0, because we already had Frederick Taylor's revolutionary idea that the common laborer is an expert. Revolutionary, right? The second wave hits, and this new revolutionary idea is that the employee is a human being. All right. Before, organizations were willing to see their employees sort of post Frederick Taylor, post 1915. So we've got about a 10-year window, something like that, where we're willing to look at employees as experts. And so managing those experts becomes really important, because if I have experts on my team and I'm not pulling their expertise out, then I'm not making effective use of the people on my team. Well, the human relations movement is sort of this pause. It starts with the Hawthorne studies. So the Hawthorne studies are looking at how are people most productive, sort of built on Frederick Taylor's idea that there's one right way to do a job. So what are the environmental impacts on that one right way to do a job? And this starts off on this idea of looking at the environment effect on productivity. That's how the Hawthorne studies start, but it develops into looking instead at how are these individual employees motivated, which sort of is impacted, in the 1930s or so. Abraham Maslow comes along and says, we are motivated by the desire to meet needs. And he says, we have very real physical needs, we have very real financial needs, but sort of the pinnacle for Maslow is our emotional needs, the need to feel self-actualization, to feel that we have tapped into our creativity and our potential and are expressing ourselves, are comfortable with ourselves, that we are emotionally whole. This focus on the emotional needs is then interpreted in an organizational context by Douglas McGregor, who writes this book called The Human Side of Enterprise. And he's looking at if we are motivated by emotional needs and we understand that that's what's motivating us, then what we need are managers who are focused on the emotional needs of our employees. And if our employees' emotional needs are being met, here's this revolutionary idea. If our employees' emotional needs are being met, if they're happy at work, they're going to be more productive. And intuitively, this seems like a really good idea, right? If I'm happy at work, then I'm going to show up on time. I'm not going to slack off at work. I'm going to take less sick days, and I'm going to be more productive. If I'm happy here, I would be more productive here, right? In fact, if you look at probably the biggest, most sought after speaker and author in organizational leadership and communication today, Simon Sinek, he has built his whole philosophy on this idea that if leaders make employees feel safe at work, then employees are going to be more effective. Teams are going to be more effective. Organizations are going to be more effective and leaders will be more successful. There's very little support from that. This is really hard to understand because intuitively it makes really good sense, and there are a lot of anecdotes that support this idea. But when we try to study this empirically, in other words, we create an experiment, we have a variable that we're looking at, such as productivity, and we are exploring it based off of the emotional needs of the employee or the worker or the laborer. There's very little empirical support to suggest that what is leading to productivity is emotional needs being met or satisfied at work. There are lots of other predictors that seem better equipped to predict whether or not an organization will be successful or productive. So, not in response to this, but sort of maybe alongside of, again, this is happening sort of in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. There's this other side of the humans approach that is happening. So we have the relations approach over here, which is looking at the emotional needs of the employee, of the laborer, and if they're happy, they're going to be productive. And then there's this other camp of theories that gets going that says not to discount the emotional needs, but certainly there must be some cognitive needs as well that have to be on balance here. It's probably not just emotional needs. So the human resources approach is being developed over here then. And what the human resource approach says is that if we can balance an individual's needs, both emotional and cognitive, with the organization's needs, then we're going to be able to better manage our people and our resources. So over here in human relations, people are seen as people with very individualized emotional needs, which again, revolutionary, right? Before, they're seen as basically a sponge. If I can wring out this expert, then I can pay somebody, I can pay a bucket, right, to catch that water, and then I don't need the expert anymore. That's classical approach. Human relations approach, highly individualized, very personal, emotional needs. This is a huge leap forward. Over here in human resources, individuals are seen less individually and more collectively. That there are a couple of emotional needs and a couple of cognitive needs. And if we can provide options to our people over here, then we can collectively leverage our human capital, our human resource, to help the organization be more effective. And so you get theorists like Blake and Motten who look at how a manager might sort of balance the needs of the organization against the needs of the employee, and how that unique combination of concern for company and for employees is going to impact how they manage their human capital, their human resource. And you get researchers like Renee Likert, who's looking at how does an organization sort of leverage this human capital in a way that is ethical, is fair, and effective. And the breakdown happens here when this idea over here about human relations is really persistent. but largely anecdotally applied. I could think of an intuitive example where the human relations approach makes good sense and it's probably accurate. The human resource side of the house, though, makes more financial sense for an organization, right? Because think about it. If I am a manager and I have to know all of the emotional needs of my people on my team, I'm probably less likely to be productive at my job beyond just making sure that the emotional needs of my people are met. Whereas in a human resource approach, if I'm providing options and I'm balancing concern for an employee and my team with a concern for the organization, then my team is moderately happy, my organization is moderately productive, which is better than my team being very happy and my organization not being productive. Now, obviously, and Blake and Mountain go into this in their managerial grid, if I can have both very productive and very happy, fantastic. I think everyone would say that's a win-win. That's really challenging to find someone who's capable of managing all of that responsibility for the organization and all of that human resource, that human capital. So we tend to find this sort of moderate ground where there's a moderate concern for the employee. We provide options for time off, but they're policies. They're blanketly applied. They're not individually applied. We provide policies for breaks, but again, not individual, blanket. You're going to see this when you see policies on decorating an office or on a dress code. Human resourcing is built on providing policies that are generally applied, and you don't get exceptions to those rules. Whereas human relations would be all about exceptions to the rules. If I can find the perfect office, decorated the right way, give this many days of time off, and have this policy or have this sort of understanding of when that employee is going to come into work, and it's highly individualized, human relations says that's where productivity is going to be. If you have 5 people on a team, that might not be so bad, but you can imagine as a team keeps growing, that's going to be harder and harder and take up more and more time on the manager side of the house. Okay, so a reminder, this semester we are looking at how these approaches are impacting communication in 4 ways: the content of communication, the direction of communication, the channel of communication, and the type of communication. So let's look at these 2 approaches, the human approaches of relation and resources. The relation approach, the content of communication in the relation approach is going to be maintenance communication. In other words, there's going to be task and there's going to be relationship, which is new. Before, in the classical approach, we just had task. Communication was about the task, the right way to do the job. What is the expertise? What are the instructions, right? Well, in relations, we're going to add in, relationship communication, which is going to change the focus. Now it's about maintaining the relationship so that the task is completed. Task is still a part of it, but it's usually gone through a relational lens. Whereas in human resourcing, we're going to have innovation as the content of the communication largely. So we have maintenance. We're still concerned about the relationship, but instead of it being getting to the task through the relationship, it's about getting to the relationship through the task, right? Human relations, building a relationship so that the task is completed. Human resourcing, focusing on the task as a way of developing the relationship. The idea here in human resourcing is this belief that as the task is getting completed, the relationship is being developed so that the next time a task comes along, we can do it better. So that's how the content of communication tends to shift when we take a human approach to communication. Now, the direction of communication is also going to shift in this approach. Remember, in a classical approach, it's a very vertical downward communication direction. In the human approach, we're introduced to this idea of horizontal communication in the relations approach. In other words, people at the same level in an organization have a reason to be talking to one another besides completing a task. And they're sharing information about how their week was, and they're sharing ideas about how the environment could be made better, or they're sharing ideas about their salary or the time off that they have. That's new. That's not something that we would see in a classical approach to organizational communication. In a human resource approach, if you remember in class, we talked a little bit about why would we have anything other than a classical approach? Do we have anything other than a classical approach where we have a strict hierarchy? Well, in human resourcing, what we're going to see more often is team-based organizations. That if I can subdivide my labor and then group like types of labor together, then I'm going to have groups of people who understand enough about one another's rules to be providing some of this innovation kind of communication. And so the direction of communication from this approach is going to be, well, every possible direction. It's going to be diagonal and horizontal and vertical, but it's going to be going both up and down in this approach, because the idea in human resourcing is innovation. Through the task, we're going to build relationships so that next time the task can be better. Then we have the channels. So that's the third thing that we're looking at in regard to how does this approach impact communication. So in a human relations approach, we're going to see most communication happening through face-to-face channels. You probably are familiar with the idea that face-to-face communication is one of the best ways to engage in sort of maintenance communication about a relationship, right? This is really taken to heart in an organization that functions out of this human relations approach. It's going to be about sitting down and seeing one another. It's going to be about communicating face-to-face when there's conflict, or when there's good news. It's going to be face-to-face. Now, a human resource approach is probably going to use whatever channel is appropriate for the situation. So, for example, we talked about policies. In human resourcing, policies are everything. So you're going to have written out policies, formal memos and letters, because it's really important that everything is applied sort of universally in a human resource approach. So you're going to have it written down. So writing is going to be really important. We didn't lose writing. Writing is really important in the classical approach, remember? So we haven't lost writing, but human resourcing is also going to recognize that their employees are humans, good, still, and that the relationship is important, because if the relationship tanks, then you're not going to be able to complete the task, and you're not going to be able to innovate on the task. So there's still going to be face-to-face communication. There's still going to be written communication in a human resourcing approach. It's just largely going to be situation-based. And then lastly, we have the type of communication that we can look at. So in a human relations approach, communication is going to be largely informal, because the goal here is to get to the task through the relationship. And so the communication is going to be largely informal. There's going to be attempts at reducing power distance so that formality doesn't have to enter into the communication. In a human resourcing approach, we're going to see both. And sometimes we're going to see both attempted simultaneously. So if you're familiar with the film Office Space, there's this boss, this manager in Office Space, whose very presence is both this informal and formal. He'll often approach his employees with a cup of coffee and ask a question like, "So, how's it going?" Great. Yeah. So listen, I haven't seen those reports recently. This is, this stereotype of a human resource mindset, an approach from management to the employee or the team member. It's an attempt at informality, and sometimes it's executed well. But often there's this undertone of formality because at the end of the day, human resource, whether it's a department or a head of HR or the mindset of HR, is to protect the company. It is there to provide policies and support those policies so that there aren't exceptions that would make the company liable to those policies. That's the whole function of human resourcing. Remember, the goal is the task. Now, the relationship can be built on so that the task can get better. But if we're unable to complete the task because of the human side of enterprise, as McGregor would say, then the human side of enterprise needs correcting. So those are the main differences between human relations approach and human resourcing approach. Again, this huge development from a classical approach, and looking at the nuances of these theories presented in this chapter are going to give you a better idea of exactly how we're building